Forensic Tales discusses topics that some listeners may find disturbing. The contents of this episode may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
In the early morning hours of December 6th, 2004, a woman was attacked inside her apartment in Knoxville, Tennessee. An intruder entered the home looking for car keys. When he didn't find them, he went into the woman's bedroom and stabbed her. She managed to escape the apartment, running down 2 flights of stairs, knocking on neighbors' doors for help. No one answered. She collapsed a short time later and died from her injuries. DNA was left at the scene, but at the time, it wasn't enough to identify a suspect. This is Forensic Tales, episode 321, The Murder of Johnia Berry. Before the headlines, before the police reports, this was someone whose friends and family described as a vibrant beauty, someone who was deeply ambitious, driven, and generous with an endless capacity for kindness. Johnia Berry was a young woman building a future, one defined by hard work, intelligence, and purpose. And in the early morning hours of December 6th, 2004, that future was violently taken from her inside her own apartment. In 2004, she graduated from college with big plans for her future. At just 21 years old, she became the youngest woman ever accepted into a law school in Michigan. At first, she thought law was the path she wanted to take. She had big dreams about becoming a lawyer. She would have the big corner office. She would make a lot of money. She would become a big-shot attorney. But after only a few weeks, she realized it wasn't where her heart was. That's something a lot of young people her age can relate to. You go to college thinking about Plan A, but eventually go with Plan B. And that's what college is for. It's all about finding yourself and discovering the kind of person you want to be when you grow up. She eventually decided that she wanted to become a child psychologist. Those who knew her say her life revolved around children. She babysat whenever she could, loved working with kids, and felt drawn to helping them in meaningful ways. It wasn't just a career choice, it was personal. So becoming a child psychologist seemed to be the perfect fit for her. She could use her book smarts while also spending her days working with children. Around that same time, she made another major life decision. She left Michigan and returned to Tennessee, leaving behind her fiancé who was attending law school. This was the first time they had ever been physically away from each other. But despite the distance, the two remained incredibly close. They even spoke on the phone every night, often talking until he fell asleep, sharing plans for the future they fully expected to build together. They were just 2 college kids who were in love. They thought they were going to spend the rest of their lives together. When she arrived in Tennessee, she reached out to an old friend from her undergraduate years, a man named Jason. Jason told her he had an extra room and invited her to stay with him, offering to split the rent while she looked for her own place. At the time, Jason was in a relationship, and his girlfriend was also friends with Johnia. The 3 of them had known each other since college, so the arrangement was comfortable and familiar. And just in case you're wondering, Jason had a girlfriend, so there wasn't anything else going on. The plan was for everything to be temporary. It was meant to be a solution that allowed her to settle back into Tennessee while she planned her next steps. As soon as she made enough money, she would move out and find her own place. She wasn't planning on living with Jason for the rest of her life. She had no idea that her friend's apartment would become the place where her life would end. Right before dawn on December 6, 2004, Jason woke up to find a man standing inside their apartment armed with a knife. He immediately confronted the intruder, but the man attacked him back, stabbing him repeatedly. Bleeding heavily, Jason managed to escape through the front door, and covered in blood, he ran to a nearby convenience store and told the clerk to call police. When police arrived at the apartment building, they found Johnia Berry lying face down near the front door, covered in blood. She was still alive, but only semi-conscious. She was so badly hurt that she was unable to respond to any questions and had been stabbed multiple times. This crime scene was as bad as it gets. She suffered stab wounds across her entire body, including her face, neck, head, back, and torso. Detectives also noted defensive wounds, indicating she fought back against her attacker. Paramedics quickly rushed her to the nearest hospital, but she died shortly after arriving in the emergency room. In total, she had been stabbed more than 20 times, but there weren't any signs of sexual assault. This was about one thing and one thing only: murder. This was a rage killing. Jason survived the attack, but he had been stabbed 9 times. But there was something about his wounds that raised some red flags. Most of his wounds were superficial. One injury in particular caught investigators' attention: a cut on his right hand. The wound was shallow and consistent with what's known as a knife slip injury. During a stabbing, especially when hands are bloody or sweaty, the attacker's hand can slide off the handle and onto the blade itself, causing a superficial cut. It's an injury more commonly seen on the person holding the knife than the person being attacked. But that wasn't the only thing that raised questions. Number 1, there were no signs of forced entry into the apartment. None of the windows or locks had been broken, and nothing was actually stolen. Number 2, the murder weapon was a kitchen knife taken from inside the home, so the killer didn't bring anything with him. He entered that apartment unarmed. And number 3, the number of stab wounds. She had been stabbed 26 times. Most people would argue that's overkill. It seemed almost impossible to think that a stranger could do something like this. Police knew that Jason had been inside the apartment at the time of the attack. They also knew his injuries were far less severe than those of his roommates. So faced with those crime scene details, detectives focused their attention on him. Very quickly, Jason became the primary suspect. The murder stunned everyone who knew her. Friends and family described her as kind, generous, and deeply driven, someone who simply didn't have enemies. There was nothing in her life that suggested she was at risk for violence like this. And yet, the attack was exceptionally brutal. The number of stab wounds, the force involved, and the sheer violence of the crime left investigators struggling to understand how something so horrific could happen to someone so universally loved. Back at the scene, investigators began piecing together what her final movements may have looked like. There were 3 distinct blood trails inside the apartment, 1 leading out the back door and 2 out the front. Blood was also found on the doors of neighboring apartments. Investigators believed she had gone door to door, desperately trying to get help. But no one answered. When police notified her family, they were completely stunned. They couldn't think of a single person who would want someone like her dead. But the police couldn't leave any stone unturned. They had to consider everyone a possible suspect. They even looked at her fiancé. But he was quickly accounted for. He was confirmed to be in Michigan at the time of the murder, so it would have been impossible for him to be the killer. So he was never considered an official suspect. With no signs of forced entry, a weapon taken from inside the apartment, and Jason present during the attack, investigators focused their attention squarely on him. All eyes were on the roommate. He was taken in for questioning, during which he agreed to fully cooperate with investigators. He even walked detectives through the apartment and described in detail what he said happened that night. He came across as someone who wanted to help. According to Jason, he went to bed around midnight. Hours later, he said he was awakened by Johnia screaming. He told police that she had a history of sleepwalking and sometimes suffered from really bad nightmares. So at first, he thought that might be what was happening, but he still decided to check on her. Jason's bedroom was located right next door to hers, and when he opened his door and stepped into the hallway, he said he was immediately confronted by a man inside the apartment. According to Jason, the man pushed him backward, causing him to fall. He told detectives that the attacker then began stabbing him. Jason said he curled into a fetal position on the floor, trying to protect himself as the man continued the attack. He claimed that at some point, he was able to kick the attacker in the groin. That gave him an opportunity to escape. He ran out of the apartment as fast as he could and fled the scene to get help. As investigators listened to Jason's account, one question remained front and center. Would his version of events match what the crime scene and the forensic evidence would ultimately show? On the blade of the murder weapon, investigators discovered a partial bloody fingerprint, but the print couldn't be lifted from the knife, so crime scene technicians documented it using high-resolution photographs. But even with those images, the fingerprint was essentially useless. It had been smeared by blood and lacked enough distinct ridge detail to be entered into any fingerprint database. So the print couldn't be used to identify or eliminate a suspect. It was another piece of evidence that existed, but couldn't yet speak. Inside Jason's bedroom, investigators found a partial shoe print left behind on a piece of cardboard lying on the floor. The print was documented and sent to the FBI, which maintains the largest shoe print database in the world. The system, nicknamed Soul Searcher, contains more than 30,000 images of shoe soles. Unlike traditional databases that rely on direct one-to-one comparisons, Soul Searcher works differently. Instead of matching a specific shoe, the system analyzes patterns and shapes on the sole. Investigators aren't looking for an exact shoe, they're looking to determine the general brand or make. The software compares design characteristics such as circles, squares, rectangles, zigzag lines, wave patterns, and other repeating shapes found in the tread. Those patterns can help narrow down the type of shoe worn by the attacker, and in some cases lead to a particular suspect. When the shoe print was entered into the database, the system returned 32 potential matches. And after further analysis, investigators narrowed those results down to a single possibility: the faded Glory Gannon shoe. The shoe was sold exclusively at Walmart, which helped narrow the field, but only to a point. Walmart sold the shoe nationwide, meaning thousands of people could have owned the same pair. So while the shoe print provided investigators with a direction, it didn't give them a suspect. It was another piece of evidence that helped shape the case, but still left police searching for answers. As investigators continued reviewing the forensic evidence, they asked Jason to take a polygraph. But during the test, he became increasingly agitated and confrontational with the administrator. The session was ultimately unsuccessful, and the results were deemed inconclusive. As with any polygraph, the findings weren't considered definitive evidence, but Jason's reaction and the fact that the test failed to produce clear results only added to investigators' concerns. At this point in the investigation, he was still the prime suspect, but all of that was about to change. DNA testing on blood recovered from the crime scene revealed 3 distinct profiles. One belonged to the victim, one belonged to Jason, and the third belonged to an unknown male. That third DNA profile was found in multiple locations throughout the crime scene. It was present on the knife used in the attack. It was found on the doorknob leading out the back of the apartment, and droplets of blood matching that profile were discovered along the back stairwell. So the presence of the unknown male's DNA, especially in areas consistent with an exit route, seemed to support Jason's claim that an intruder had been inside the apartment. Around that same time, investigators took another look at Jason's polygraph, and it was discovered that the examiner had failed to follow several standard testing protocols. Even more concerning, the results had been misinterpreted. When the polygraph data was reviewed correctly, investigators determined that Jason had actually passed the examination. And with the DNA evidence pointing to an unknown male and the polygraph no longer raising red flags, police began to move away from Jason as a suspect. For the first time since the attack, the investigation's focus shifted. Maybe the roommate was telling the truth. Maybe he was just another victim. Detectives worked with Jason to create a composite sketch of the attacker. Using specialized software, a technician entered Jason's description into the system, refining the image step by step. Jason reviewed each version until he felt the composite accurately reflected the man he had seen inside the apartment. He described the attacker as a white male, approximately 5'8", around 180 pounds. But one detail stood out more than the rest. He told investigators the man had unusual eyes, a distinctive shape he described as resembling a teardrop or pecan. Police released the image to the public, airing it repeatedly on local news stations night after night, and the response was immediate. Tips poured in. Each lead was documented and followed up on, as investigators remained hopeful that forensic evidence, particularly DNA, would ultimately identify the killer. But when the unknown male DNA profile was entered into CODIS, no matches were found. But that wasn't entirely surprising. CODIS has limitations. It doesn't include juvenile profiles, and it only contains DNA from individuals who have been convicted, or in some cases, arrested for certain crimes. Anyone outside those categories wouldn't show up in the system. Then, police received what they believed was their strongest lead yet. A tip pointed them toward a 19-year-old man named Michael Percival. For the first time in months, investigators felt they may be closing in on the person responsible. Michael Percival lived about 2 miles from the apartment where the attack happened. Police also learned he had been involved in criminal activity in the area, including burglaries. When officers went to pick him up, Percival was barefoot. He asked police to retrieve his shoes for him. And when detectives took possession of the shoes, one investigator immediately noticed something that stopped her cold. They were faded Glory Gannon shoes. The tread pattern on the soles appeared to match the partial shoe print recovered from the crime scene. The design, the shapes, the overall wear, it all looked consistent with what had been left behind in the apartment. At that moment, it seemed like investigators had finally found the person responsible. And for the first time since the murder happened, the forensic evidence appeared to be lining up with a suspect. During questioning, Michael Percival told police he had been present when Johnia was killed. He claimed he went to her apartment with another person and that someone else was the one who went inside and carried out the stabbing. But almost immediately, parts of his story began to fall apart. Michael told investigators that he had forced his way into the apartment using a crowbar, but that claim was directly contradicted by the crime scene. There were no signs of forced entry, no damage to doors or frames, and no evidence that a crowbar had been used. Investigators also took a closer look at Michael's shoes. While they were the same brand and model as the shoes linked to the crime scene, they weren't an exact match. The FBI determined that the wear pattern on Michael's shoes was different from the wear pattern left behind in Jason's bedroom. Then came the most definitive result. Michael's DNA didn't match the unidentified male's DNA found at the scene. At that point, investigators concluded that Michael wasn't responsible for the attack. His statements had been false, and his involvement amounted to inserting himself into an active homicide investigation, diverting time and resources without bringing police any closer to the truth. Once again, investigators were left with the same unanswered question they had faced from the beginning. Who was the unknown man whose DNA had been left behind? With Michael ruled out, the case stalled, and police were forced back to the beginning. As the investigation stalled, her family refused to let her case disappear. They established a $70,000 reward, hoping it would generate new information and keep pressure on the case. But it wasn't just about money, it was about visibility, about refusing to let her become another forgotten name in an unsolved file. Her family worked tirelessly to keep her story in the public eye. Billboards went up, media interviews continued. Her face, along with the composite sketch of the man believed to be responsible, remained visible across the community. They believed that someone somewhere knew something. For a time, it appeared that despite all of those efforts, the case might never be solved. The DNA profile remained unidentified. Leads dried up, years passed. Then nearly 2.5 years later, something changed. In June of 2007, police received an anonymous tip. The caller suggested investigators take a closer look at a 22-year-old man named Taylor Olson. What immediately caught investigators' attention was his resemblance to the composite sketch. The facial features, the eyes in particular, were strikingly similar. And Olson wasn't a stranger to the police. He had a juvenile record and had previously been linked to minor crimes, including breaking into cars. Nothing violent, nothing that would immediately suggest he was capable of committing such a brutal attack. In fact, investigators would later say he didn't fit the profile of what they imagined the killer would look like. But after years of unanswered questions, the resemblance was too close to ignore. By this point, nearly 2 years had passed since the murder, and investigators knew something important. Even if they were on the right track, it was unlikely the killer had held on to the exact shoes he wore that night or any other obvious physical evidence. When police began looking into Taylor Olson, they learned he no longer had the shoes investigators were interested in, but multiple people close to him said he owned them at the time of the murder. According to investigators, both Olson's mother and his ex-girlfriend recognized the shoe brand and style and told police he wore them around the period when the crime happened, but that he didn't have them anymore. It wasn't a perfect piece of evidence. It couldn't place him inside the apartment by itself. But in a case where the shoe print had already narrowed to a very specific model, it mattered, especially when paired with what investigators cared about most: DNA. Police obtained a DNA sample from Olson and sent it to the lab for comparison against the unknown male profile found at the scene. And then they got the call they'd been waiting for. The lab reported that Olson's DNA matched the unidentified male DNA recovered from the crime scene, DNA that had been found on the knife and along the suspected exit path, including the back door area and the back stairwell. In September 2007, Taylor Olson was arrested for murder. Investigators also noted something else when Olson was in custody: linear scars on his hand, injuries that, according to police, could be consistent with a hand slipping onto the blade of a knife during a stabbing. At first, Olson denied everything. He told police they had the wrong person, that the lab must have made a mistake, and insisted he hadn't been there. But as the questioning continued, his story shifted. Eventually, Olson admitted he had been in the area that night. He claimed he was out looking for something to steal, specifically car keys. From there, Olson offered an explanation that investigators and later prosecutors didn't accept. Olson claimed that Johnia attacked him with a knife and that what happened next was self-defense. According to police, he became emotional and began crying as he described it. But prosecutors argued the evidence told a very different story. Their theory was that Olson found an unlocked apartment and entered, intending to steal. Once inside, he picked up a kitchen knife from the apartment, either to threaten someone if he was confronted or because he believed it would help him control the situation. Prosecutors believed that when Olson entered the bedroom, Johnia woke up, and in that moment, everything escalated. They argued, he panicked, and instead of fleeing, he attacked. They also pointed to the forensics to explain why the violence was so extreme. According to investigators, Olson's hand likely slipped on the bloody knife during the assault, cutting him and causing him to leave his own blood behind, blood that later became the unknown male DNA profile found across the scene. After leaving her bedroom, prosecutors argued Olson encountered Jason, leading to a second struggle and more blood evidence. Investigators also believed the shoe print discovered in Jason's room, left on the piece of cardboard, was made during this phase of the attack as the intruder moved through the apartment and out. And in the state's view, the cumulative evidence painted a consistent picture. An unknown male's DNA appeared on multiple items tied to the attack and escape route. The shoe print pattern was narrowed to a specific shoe model that Olson was known to have owned. Olson had injuries that could be consistent with knife slippage, and Olson had no legitimate reason to be inside the apartment. To investigators, the most chilling part was this. There was no relationship, no personal history, no motive that matched the level of violence. And yet she had been stabbed more than 20 times, an amount of force that still left detectives and prosecutors asking the same question that haunted the case from the beginning. Why was the attack so brutal, if she was essentially a stranger? After his arrest, Taylor Olson never provided a clear explanation for what happened inside that apartment. There was no confession that explained why, no motive that made sense, no reason that could account for the level of violence inflicted on someone he didn't know. And before those questions could ever be answered in court, the case came to an abrupt and devastating end. In March of 2008, the same day his trial was set to begin, Taylor Olson was found dead in his cell at the Knox County Jail. He had taken his own life by hanging. With his death, any chance of hearing answers directly from the person responsible was gone. There would be no trial, no testimony, no explanation for why she was targeted or why the attack was so brutal. For her family, that loss of answers was another form of trauma, one that no verdict could ever fix. What remained, however, was the evidence. The forensics told a clear story, even when the killer would not. DNA left behind on the knife, on the doorknob, and along the escape route identified the man who had been inside the apartment. A partial shoe print helped narrow the investigation toward the right suspect. A bloody fingerprint, though incomplete, was consistent with the same individual. Piece by piece, forensic science did what human memory, witnesses, and confessions could not. It identified the person responsible without ever explaining why. And that absence of motive is one of the hardest realities of this case. There was no relationship, no prior conflict, no personal connection, just a moment of opportunity, an unlocked door, and a level of violence that remains impossible to fully understand. In the aftermath, the family made a choice. Instead of allowing her story to end with unanswered questions, they focused on preventing the same delays from happening to other families. They helped create a support organization called Hope for Victims, offering advocacy and resources to those navigating violent crime and loss. They also worked to change the law. Their efforts helped lead to legislation requiring DNA collection from individuals arrested for violent crimes. Johnia Berry was remembered by those who loved her as ambitious, compassionate, and deeply kind, a young woman drawn to helping others, especially children, and someone with her entire future ahead of her. Her life was taken without reason. But because of forensic science and because her family refused to let her case be forgotten, the truth of what happened didn't disappear with her killer. And while there may never be closure, there is accountability, there is change, and there is a legacy that continues to protect others.
Forensic Tales is a Rockefeller audio production. The show is written and produced by me, Courtney Fretwell. If you'd like to help create compelling new cases, fund research, and assist with production and editing costs, you can support the show with a small monthly contribution. In return, you'll be one of the first to listen to new ad-free episodes and gain access to exclusive content. To learn more, visit patreon.com/Forensic Tales. Forensic Tales is a podcast made possible by our Patreon producers. If you'd like to become a producer of the show, head over to our Patreon page or send me an email at courtney@forensictales.com. For a complete list of sources used in this episode, please visit forensictales.com.
If you enjoy the show, please consider leaving us a positive review. Make sure you're subscribed to the show so you don't miss an episode.
Thank you for listening, and see you next week. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings.